thy sorrow, let others be blessed. Go give them the sunshine. Tell Jesus the rest.
Morning. I would invite you to open up in your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17 is where we'll spend the bulk of our time here this morning. We're going to look quite a bit at that chapter, kind of bounce around within it, make some applications, and then an hour and a half, 2 hours from now, the lesson will be yours, so you can rest comfortably in knowing that. It is good to be with each and every one of you. We do have a good number of people that are with us this morning from out of town or from different congregations or just traveling through, so we want you to know how much we appreciate your presence and how much we appreciate your time spent with us. It's always good to worship with brethren from like-minded places, or brethren of like-minded faith from other places. Let me just start off by saying that. They also appreciate those who took part in worship this morning, Colton leading us in songs, and Nick with reading us in scriptures, and the men that have taken part leading us in prayer this morning. It's been a fantastic service, one in which I think we can all leave here hopefully saying that it has been good for us to be together. I hope I don't do anything within the next hour and a half, 2 hours to mess that up. For those of you who know or care, tonight is, of course, the Super Bowl. I'm sure that's not news to anybody. Those of you who have followed any kind of sports or even turned on the TV within the past couple of weeks have probably seen people talking about this matchup. And basically what you have, for those who don't know, is a football game. What you have between two different teams, and kind of the cornerstones of both these teams is Peyton Manning for the Denver Broncos, Cam Newton for the Carolina Panthers. You have both those guys going against each other, regardless of what your own personal opinions is about either one of those two people. The press have kind of labeled this game as being David versus Goliath, and that's kind of an interesting way to put it, because I think a couple years ago, if you were to talk about Peyton Manning versus Cam Newton, you would talk about it being David and Goliath kind of in the opposite direction. Personally, I don't think Peyton Manning is anybody's David, it's anybody else's Goliath, but that's beside the point. But tonight is this Super Bowl. You have this kind of mismatch from what a lot of people are talking about. You have this David versus Goliath thing where two people that are so unevenly matched that it just seems that the odds are insurmountable. And so later tonight we'll see if the pundits were true, they were right about this altogether. We'll see if Cam Newton absolutely destroys Peyton Manning, or if the sheriff in his 50th or in the 50th Super Bowl will go out on top, as I think he will, and as I think the world should let him do it. That's what I think is going to happen. But that analogy of David versus Goliath I think is very fitting, because what you have is one really, really strong guy versus one guy that doesn't really seem to be that much of a match. And how they ended up in the Super Bowl was beyond me. I have no idea. But that's nevertheless kind of the idea that we're going with here. But it seems to fit, I think, with the original motif of what the original David and Goliath was. If you look in 1 Samuel chapter 17, this original story that probably all of us have heard since probably the time that we were 5 or 6 years old, all of us remember this type of story. You have the really puny guy that comes with his rocks and comes with his little sling, and he shows up against the champion of Philistia. And Philistia, of course, would be a huge region right to the west of where Israel would be. So when you're talking about the champion of what would be a conglomeration of warring states, you're talking about a complete mismatch. Some guy who's not a soldier at all, who spends most of his time by himself with a bunch of sheep out in the middle of the pasture somewhere. You have him going up against a guy who has only known war his entire life, who quadruples him in size. The real idea of David and Goliath is something that is an extreme mismatch. There's literally no competition between the two. At least that's how it's perceived. And when you match these two people up side by side, not Peyton Manning and Cam Newton, but when you match these two people up side by side, that's kind of the idea of the mismatch that you have. Goliath has numerous advantages. For one, being his gargantuan height. There's two different ideas on how tall he actually was. The Masoretic text, which is what our Bible comes from, our English Bible takes its translation from, lists him at 6 cubits and a span, which would place him right around the neighborhood of 9 feet 9 inches tall. The Septuagint places him at 4 cubits in a span, which would put him right at about the height of 6 feet 6 inches tall. So either way, 6 feet 9 inches tall. So either way, whatever you're talking about when you look at Goliath, he's a pretty gigantic dude. For reference sake, I'm about 6'3 and a half, 6'4 on a good day if I'm wearing the right pair of shoes. But this guy is a massive beast of a man. The average Jew in that time period would be roughly around the height of 5'5", 5'6". So no matter if he's 9'9" or he's 6'9", this guy is absolutely massive no matter which way you put it at. He also has a distinct advantage when it comes to experience. This guy is called the champion of Philistia. We had talked about that a second ago, about these warring states that literally had known nothing except war. And so when you're talking about somebody who's been from the day he was born, more or less bred for this type of moment, and Saul would say as much, you have somebody that knows everything about battle. He's been in battles, he's been on one-on-one conflicts. And when we talk about this idea of somebody who's a champion, you're talking about somebody who is engaged in a one-on-one combat on a regular basis. This type of David and Goliath fight is right in his wheelhouse. It's something he's done hundreds of times probably before. He also has a distinct advantage when it comes to weaponry. I don't have enough space on this PowerPoint to kind of put all the things that he has, but if you look at chapter 17, verses 5 through 7, it kind of gives the idea of what he's looking at. You have the helmet, you have the scale armor, you have the spear, you have the greaves on the legs, you also have a sword that's sheathed. This guy came and he meant business. This guy came for one reason only, and that was to kill whoever wandered out in that little space between them. He also has a distinct advantage when it comes to strength. This is something that probably for us kind of goes by the wayside, but the armor that we talked about here consists of multiple different parts that themselves were absolutely massive. And keep in mind, this guy not only is wearing these for his own protection, he's not a tank, he's not just going to wander out there. This guy intends to be fully mobile in hand-to-hand combats wearing all these things. I got some different measurements on what 5,000 shekels of brass actually would be. Anywhere from 75 pounds to 150 pounds. That's kind of, you can kind of guess which one of those, I guess if you want to make up your own mind, which one of those probably is the more accurate one. You also have the spearhead, which is about 15 to 17 pounds. And then you have the shaft of the spear itself. It calls it similar to a weaver's beam, which would be about 6 feet long and about 2.5 inches in diameter. So this guy is wielding close to about 150, close to 200 pounds, depending on what kind of measurements you want to use. And he's wearing all of this, intending to be fully mobile in hand-to-hand combat. Keep in mind that today's military wears anywhere between 35 to 150 pounds of body armor or equipment at any one point in time. But that type of warfare, of point and shoot, of move, of positioning, it's a little bit different than the hand-to-hand combat that Goliath was going to be engaged in. So these are the kind of the advantages that Goliath has. If Goliath walks out in the front, he starts taunting people, as the text dictates that he did. He starts taunting people, he starts asking for a battle. People are going to look at that, especially if the average Jewish male at 5'5", 5'6", who probably doesn't have close to this type of armor or the type of experience that he has. There's going to be a lot of fear there. They don't want to come out there. And that is the exact reason why David, after 40 days of taunting, then wanders out. But David has a distinct advantage too. Whereas Goliath has all this equipment, he has all this experience, he has the physical prowess that's necessary to win this battle, David, on the other hand, has God. And Goliath doesn't see the value in that. Neither do the rest of the Philistines. But what most alarming is, or what the more alarming thing is that none of the Jews recognize that as well. When David shows up on the scene, and we'll read about this here in a second, when David shows up on the scene and he sees the taunts that for 40 days Goliath has been issuing towards the nation of Israel, towards their God, David doesn't hesitate for a moment. He understands first and foremost who's backing him up and what this guy is doing right in front of him. David instantly recognizes that in this type of match, even though to the physical eyes it may seem to be a little bit of a mismatch, David fully understood who had the advantage here. You see this within David's own life. Whenever David is being crowned as king by Nathan, not too many chapters previously, I think in the chapter immediately before this, Nathan shows up and looks at all of David and his 7 other brothers, and he looks at all of them one by one, and then he looks at little tiny David. You remember what happens? Nathan looks at David and he says, surely this can't be the one. And then God tells him that man looks on the outside appearance, but God looks at the heart. That little bit of foreshadowing that's contained within 1 Samuel chapter 16 leads into this bigger discussion of how everything looks that Goliath has the advantage, but the true advantage lays within David. Because David has God at his back. That truly is the most advantageous thing of all. Most of us, since we've probably heard this story several times before, I hope that what I'm about to say is not a spoiler for anybody, but David ends up winning this battle, I think, pretty much hands down. And I hope that's not a spoiler for anybody. We'll read a little bit more into that. But David kind of wins this. I think that's pretty much a given. Most of us understand that. If I did ruin that for you, I sincerely, deeply apologize, and we will have, once again, our favorite conversation that we have in the back. But the fact that David wins is not really the surprising part when you look at the advantages that we just talked about. That's not really the surprising part. And that's not really even the lesson for today. The reason that we're talking about David is not the fact that he wins. It's the fact of how he fights in the first place, or why he fights. Why David is even in the middle of this David versus Goliath kind of setup is mind-boggling. Because David should have been nowhere near this battle. The Philistines should have never been anywhere near Israel. The fact that this encounter even took place in my mind, is a direct failure of the people to not eradicate the Philistines when they came through the conquest previously. They left people kind of straggling, they left people all over the place. Those people banded together, had allies. A couple centuries later, now they're the Philistines. They've captured people from other tribes, they've built up their forces. This battle should not have taken place. When you look at 1 Samuel chapter 17, you look kind of at the background of what he's talking about here, it tells us a lot about why this battle takes place in the first place. 1 Samuel chapter 17, starting in verse 1. It says, Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Sokah, which belongs to Judah. They camped between Sokah and Azekah and Ephes-Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah, drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them. Now if you're just reading the first verse, especially the first verse, a little into the second verse, you're reading all those place names, it can be very easy for you to sit back and let your eyes glaze over and just think those are places that are so far away from where we are right now. And you'd be right. But what verse 1 points out is a distinct idea that he's driving at here. The fact that this battle even takes place. When you look at these place names, and this Old Testament geography is a lot harder than you would think, so this may not be exactly accurate, but the best I can describe, this is the nation of Israel. This is what we commonly describe as the nation of Israel. This battle takes place roughly in this area. You have this little square that's going to then encapsulate within this area. The little arrows that you see here are where the nation of Israel has advanced. You can see where Philistia has advanced into this. Philistia is not sitting back on the defense, letting Israel take the fight to them. The point about this is Philistia has marched into Israelite territory and is determined to take over these southern territories of Israel. In other words, Philistia has got their army together, they got their stuff packed, and they marched right into the promised land with the sole intent of taking Israel away from God. And that's why this battle takes place in the first place. When you look at this battle a little bit more spectacularly, you have one army on one side, you have another army on one side, they're at a stalemate. This is the area as we know it today. Two mountains with the creek running down the middle of them. You have one person on one side, you have another person on one side, and you have this gigantic field in which this battle will take place. For 40 days, these two armies sat there and stared at each other because both of them were terrified to go after the other person. And Goliath finally looks at the situation and he thinks, you know what? Instead of all of us killing each other, I'm stronger than probably anybody else in this world. Not me, Goliath is. So I'm going to march down there and I'm going to take care of this by myself. Taunts the armies of the living God, looks at Israel and says, you do not have the strength or the faith to defeat me. And the fact that this battle even takes place where it does is a commentary on the state of Israel as it stands right then. That they allow this neighboring alien nation not just to go to war with them, but to march literally right through their front door and take a seat right on their couch. That's more or less what Philistia was doing with this thing. Look at the next couple of verses, starting in verse 8. When you look at this section, this is also why David fights. Starting in verse 8 of chapter 17. Starting in verse 8, after it describes who Goliath is and his physical prowess, it says, He, being Goliath, stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, Why do you come out to draw up in battle array? In other words, why are you guys even here? That's kind of an Old Testament version of a put down. But in verse 8 he says, Why do you come out to us in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? There's a distinct choice in the wording here. I am a Philistine, and you guys are just following some nameless leader, some kind of petty ruler. Choose a man for yourselves, let him come down to me, we'll fight this out. Verse 9, if he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become our servants and serve us. And again, verse 10, the Philistine said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And when Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Keep in mind, this would be days and weeks before David would even show up on the scene. And Goliath, for a month and a half, walks out and says, I defy the ranks of Israel, I defy you, and I defy your God. And verse 11 shows the attitude of these people that were sitting there, not just because they had marched right into their homeland, they were terrified of this guy. They were terrified of Goliath, who's the biggest man that any of them had probably ever seen. And nobody wants to take this guy on. When you look at verses 36 and 37, it gets even more heated when David points out, or rather Goliath points out, that he begins to taunt specifically God. He begins to take charges right against God. This God that you have is not powerful enough. I'm cursing you. I'm defaming you guys. Every one of you are cowards. That's what David had heard. And when David hears that, that's when David begins to act. Keep in mind that out of all the people in Israel at this time period, David would have been the absolute last person to fight Goliath. Let that marinate for a second. Out of all the people in the nation of Israel, David was the last person that anybody expected to walk out there in the middle of that land. David, of course, was the last of 8 brothers and sisters. 8 brothers. His 3 oldest were in the battle. They were actually fighting. There were 4 other brothers in between David and the youngest guy in Saul's army. He shouldn't even been in the area. And keep in mind, too, that on both sides of the battle, in Philistia and in Israel, nobody thought David could win. Saul tried to talk him out of it, saying, well, he's been a warrior from his youth, and you are but a youth. Let that sink in for a second. He's been a warrior from his youth. David, are youth still? You're still a young guy? And his brother, when David even showed up on the scene, his brother looked at David and said, why are you even here? You're just here to see the battle. That's the only reason that you decided to show up today. Nobody wanted David to go out there and fight in the first place. And Saul showed a distinct lack of courage and a lack of leadership that he let this blasphemy go on for nearly a month and a half. I want you to look at verses 31 down to verse 37 of 1 Samuel 17. Look at this real quick. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, starting in verse 31, listen to what happens here. 1 Samuel chapter 17, starting in verse 31, the taunts are out. Goliath is blaspheming against God. He's cursing God. It says, when these words which David had spoke were heard, the words that he wanted to fight Goliath, they told him to Saul, and he sent for them. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. For your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And then Saul said to David, you are not able to go up against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth. That's what we just talked about. Verse 34, but David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went out after him, attacked him, rescued it from his mouth, and he rose up against me. I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. That's what we just discussed. Verse 37, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion, from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go and may the Lord be with you. That's a notable point. Because right within these verses, you notice a distinct difference between the leadership styles of somebody like David and of somebody like Saul. Ask yourself real quick. We've talked about Saul in the past. We've discussed him in different sermons and different Bible classes. What kind of man was Saul? Saul physically was a person that towered above everybody else. Saul, from the first several chapters of 1 Samuel, when he's first chosen as king, was somebody who was head and shoulders above anybody else. He was the physical equivalent of Goliath, so to speak. He was the Israelite version of who Goliath was. If anybody was going to walk out there and fight Goliath, it would have been somebody who had the stature like Saul. Somebody who physically matched him at least as close as humanly possible. But yet when Saul is chosen as king, when the lots are drawn and the family of Saul is chosen, Benjamin's tribe is chosen and Saul's family is chosen, where is Saul? Do you remember where Saul is? He's hiding out by the baggage train. And when he's chosen as king, they have to send somebody to go find Saul and let him know that he was just anointed as king. And Saul doesn't react with happiness. Saul is terrified. Fast forward several years later, after Saul has just failed in defeating the Amalekites, and Samuel shows him that he's going to tear the nation of Israel from Saul and give it to somebody else who is a servant. And Saul immediately gets terrified. He's struck with this fact that the nation is going to be ripped from him. And then Goliath shows up a couple of chapters later. As Goliath is walking out and taunting the armies of the living God, Saul has faith in who Jehovah is, but his relationship with him is so far gone and so fractured that the absolute last thing he wants to do is walk out in that plan. And so while 40 days are passing and Goliath is walking out and taunting God, Saul is hiding in his tent, terrified for his life. And here comes David. Little tiny David. David was years away from being conscripted into the army. And David shows up and wants to fight Goliath, doesn't have an ounce of hesitation. And Saul looks at him and says in verse 37, go and may the Lord be with you. In essence saying, because the Lord's departed from me. I don't have any relationship with God. And if I have a chance, if anybody has a chance in defeating this beast, it's going to be with God's help. David is years away from Saul as far as leadership styles. Fast forward several years later, look at 2 Samuel. I want to point something out here real quick. This is a story that oftentimes goes overlooked. 2 Samuel 21. 2 Samuel chapter 21. This is a story that oftentimes goes overlooked when we're talking about David and Goliath, especially David in later years. And Saul's leadership style is being markedly different than David's. When Goliath shows up and taunts God, taunts the armies of the living God, Saul is back in his tent hiding, terrified for his life because he knows what his relationship with God is like. 2 Samuel chapter 21, after David has endured numerous events in his life. This is right before or right around the time when he's going to take the census scripturally. This is when Absalom is already dead. He's rebelled against the kingdom. This is after the sin with Bathsheba. Then David, here in 2 Samuel chapter 21, much more advanced in years than he would be in 1 Samuel 17. In 2 Samuel 21, starting in verse 15, it says, "Now when the Philistines were at war yet again with Israel," there's a common theme, "David, the king of Israel, went down and his servants with him, and they fought against the Philistines, and David became weary." Why? Because he was much more advanced in years than he was in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Then Ishbi-Benob, who was among the descendants of the giant, talking about Goliath, the weight of whose spear was 300 shekels of bronze in weight, was girded with a new sword, and he intended to kill David. Why? Because David is at the front. David is fighting. Verse 17, "But Abishai the son of Zeruiah helped him, and he struck the Philistine down and killed him." Now listen to this. "Then the men of David swore to him, saying, 'You will not go out with us again to battle, so that you do not extinguish the lamp of Israel.'" What is David doing even in his much more advanced years? I'm not going to put an age on that because I'd like to make it to lunch before getting beaten up. Why is he out there fighting, even though he's much more advanced in years? Because David leads from the front. The difference in leadership styles between David and Saul are light years apart. And if you look at the history of every great ruler that has ever existed among the span of time, every single one of them led from the front. Who was in England whenever Normandy was invaded by the Allies? Eisenhower. Who was fighting at the front of the Greek army whenever they were on a 3.5-year rampage towards Egypt? Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, on more than one occasion, almost had a spear go right through him. And his men had to eventually tell him, "You need to go back there and fight. Let us take care of this. You go back there because you're kind of the icon of this place. You go back there and do your thing. We'll do our thing, you do your thing." David, even much more advanced in years, was leading from the front. Saul didn't have a prayer of doing that. And you see the differences in this. But the reason that these two people are polar opposites is because exactly what David told Saul. When you look at David, and Saul looks at David as he's coming into the tent, and Saul looks at him and says, "Well, you can't fight because he's been a warrior from his youth, and you're but a youth." David doesn't look at that. And David looks back at the way in which he's won all these battles in the past, against the lion, against the bear, against whatever else, and he says, "God helped me then, and God will help me now." Ladies and gentlemen, that's the difference between David and Saul. And so little David shows up. After the reason why he's even there in the first place, the idea of how he wins is mind-boggling. Because here shows up little David. We don't have a size, we don't have an age or anything, at least at this point. It says that he's ruddy and good-looking, so you can say that he's young, probably a little handsome. Got a little bit of swagger to him. He walks out into the middle of this field, and he doesn't have a sword. He doesn't have body armor. He doesn't have Saul's gargantuan breastplate on him. He's not carrying a shield. He's not carrying a gladius or a rudius. What does he show up with? He shows up with a little sling and 5 smooth stones that he picked up on the way out to battle. And he walks out there and he looks Goliath in the eye, and Goliath is beside himself with humor. And he mocks David and says, "I am a giant, more or less, and you come out to me with sticks and stones as if I'm a dog." And taunts him right there in front of everybody. And then David, of course, turns tail and runs. He's like, "Goliath, you're right. I didn't realize what I was getting myself into. We go back to Saul's tent. We're going to hang out. We're going to watch a movie later. You just do your thing." That's obviously what happened. David stands his ground. And he puts a stone in the sling. He twirls it and he hurls it against Goliath's head. He hurls him with one shot and slays the giants. We oftentimes look at this sword and the sling. We think to ourselves, well, this was just a little child's toy that David walked out there with. And David just kind of grabbed his little pistol, his little toy gun, and he walked out there and shot him. It's a little bit true. But what we fail to realize oftentimes about the sling was that this was a pretty deadly weapon. But even more than it being a deadly weapon, it was a weapon of skill. If you remember towards the end of Judges chapter 21, it's mentioned that there were 700 choice men of Gibeah who could twirl a sling and hit a hair and not miss. This was a skill game. And it was a skilled weapon, something you had to spend years to master. It wasn't like a sword you could just kind of poke at people, and then a spear you could just kind of jab. If you wanted to use a sling, which was deadly, you spend years practicing this. The sling oftentimes just kind of goes unnoticed in this whole equation. But as he picks up these little smooth stones that are probably, this is actually the brook that we're talking about in this area, he picks up these little smooth stones that have probably been run through a river for hundreds of years, maybe decades, whatever it is. Obviously the rough sides are brushed off them, very aerodynamic. I'm not a scientist, although I do play one in 8th grade. But he picks up 5 of these stones, puts them in his little pouch, and steps over the brook and walks over and takes things that look like this. These are 5 of the stones most likely the size that he would have taken, puts them in his hand and puts them in a sling. And these stones were not just little pebbles that he kind of throws at people. These things were the size of golf balls or tennis balls. And when hurled at a speed of 65 miles per hour, can kill a person in one shot. If you look at Roman and Greek doctor manuals from that time period, what you'll find is that there are pages upon pages telling their apothecaries how to treat people that have been wounded by these types of things. A bullet from one of these slings, if that hits you, pierces your body armor, it has massive internal damage, you'll be out for the battle. You'll most likely die within days. Even if you do eventually get up, you're not getting up anytime soon. So these things are pretty violent weapons. What's most humorous, I think, about these, and this is just a little side note, I found that a lot of these things had inscriptions on the side. A lot of these stones that slings used within the time period of Greco-Roman history, they had little words inscribed on them. This one, for instance, has the word catch written on it, has the word take this on something else. Similar to World War II bomber pilots when they used to spray paint different designs in their bombs when they dropped them over enemy territory, especially over Germany. But these things had little inscriptions on them. And contrary to the image, and a lot of times when we look at these things where they're slinging them above their head and they just let them go, these things were released oftentimes in an underhand motion. Those of you who have watched fast-pitch softball know this type of motion. That's what we're looking at here. But it was a sling of about 3 feet long, and you had to release it at the moment. You had to release one cord of it at the moment that you wanted to aim it. That cord would be released, that stone would shoot out. It took years to master. If you wanted to get more distance, you would have a longer sling. That's basically how that whole system worked. So here shows up David, and Goliath is just an uncircumcised Philistine who only knows hand-to-hand combat, probably isn't familiar with this type of eloquent type of battle. He shows up and he mocks David. David puts the stone in his sling that he picks up on the way out to battle, puts it in his sling, twirls it around, drills him in the face. And then as if that wasn't enough, David walks over, looks all the Philistines in the eye. This is where I'm embellishing. David walks over, looks all the Philistines in the eye, draws Goliath's own sword out of his sheath, and cuts his head off. And then calmly turns back around and presents it to Saul. Meanwhile, the Israelites rally and they tear through the Philistines and chase them miles away from the battle scene. That's this event that unfolded. But the real reason that David won was not because of these stones. It wasn't because of the inscription that he put. I don't know if he had time on the way there to write, "Take this, Goliath." I don't know if he did that. The reason that David won was not because he was skilled with the sling. The reason David won is because he had God. Look at verses 44 through 47 of 1 Samuel chapter 17. Flip back over there. The reason that David won was not because he was skilled with a sling, although he certainly was that. The reason that David won was because God was on his side. 1 Samuel chapter 17, starting in verse 44. The Philistines said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and to the beasts of the field." And then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword or a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. And this day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you." That's exactly what he did. "And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that I am the greatest champion in Israel." Is that what he said? Look back at verse 46. "All the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by a sword or by a spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." Notice no less than 5 times in that speech does David give credit for his future victory to his God. The same God that Goliath has spent a month and a half making fun of. And David says it's not going to be sword or spear. It's not going to be even the sling. It's going to be God who gives the battle into my hand. And you have to imagine if you're just soldier B or soldier 13982 in the Israelite army and you're seeing this situation unfold before you, you have to look at it and think to yourself, there is no way that David would have ever beat Goliath on his own. There has to be something a little bit deeper here. And that's why whenever David beats Goliath, they grab their swords and they charge after the Philistines as fast as they possibly can because they know God is with them. There's a note that's mentioned in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 13 when it says just very simply that the Spirit of the Lord has departed from Saul and that it came mightily upon David. And you see that in full view here in David. You see this relationship unfold as David begins his campaign as being the greatest king in Israelites' history. This is where it begins. But it doesn't begin because of who David is. It begins because of David's relationship with God. In Psalm 44, look at this real quick. Psalm 44. Psalm 44, starting in verse 4. This is not by David, but I think it very much applies to him. Psalm 44, starting in verse 4. The psalmist writes, "You are my king, O God. Command victories for Jacob. Through you will we push back our adversaries. Through your name we will trample down those who rise up against us. For I will not trust in my bow, nor will my sword save me. But you have saved us from our adversaries. You have put to shame those who hate us. And in God we have boasted all day long, and we will give thanks to your name forever." Question: what did Israel forget time after time when they slipped into apostasy? They forgot that they were God's people. As long as God was on their side, as long as they were fighting for God, as long as they were obedient to God, they won battle after battle after battle. And they accomplished things that the world before them had never seen before. But the second the attention began to be off of God and onto themselves, that's when they began to slip. Ladies and gentlemen, isn't the same true in today's world? When we look in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12 teaches us that our fight is not against principalities and powers, but against the spiritual forces of wickedness. Ask yourself, what weapon can you pick up to go fight that? If you're in this tent, are you going to pick up Saul's spear and Saul's sword and then go right out after this spiritual force of the darkness? That's not going to do anything. The only way that we're going to defeat Satan, who we talked about last week, the only way that we're going to defeat Satan is with God at our side. The only way God's going to be at our side is if we're obedient to Him in the first place. In a lot of ways, this David and Goliath story is not really even about David and Goliath. It shows a much bigger, kind of a microcosm of so many bigger things. It shows the relationship between the nation of Israel and all the nations around them. It shows the battle between Jesus and all the people that were opposing Him. And it shows the battle that we have with seemingly insurmountable forces every single day of our life who all want to see us fail, who all taunt our God, who all blaspheme our God's name, and who all tell us all the ways in which we will lose. And you know what? If we look at ourselves in that game, if we just look at our own physical bodies and say, yeah, you're right, I probably will lose, then we will. But when we begin to look at God, when we begin to look at His protection, His power, and His might, then we be confident that if we're on the Lord's side, nothing against us will stand. We have to ask ourselves in this situation, we looked at the advantages that Goliath had versus David, and there were numerous physical advantages. But you have to ask yourselves at the end of this, which one was really David? And which one was Goliath? Which one of these two people had the advantage? And which one of them was the weaker of the two? I think looking back on it, it's easy to point out, well, obviously David had God, and so that must mean something. David had God, and so obviously Goliath was the weaker. We don't always do things. We sometimes look at the physical and say to ourselves, well, obviously Goliath is so much bigger, and the only reason David won was because he got lucky with the sling, and God had nothing to do with that. You and I both know that's the truth, or that's not the truth. And when we talk about our own battles that we have with the world, we can say to ourselves, well, it's a good thing I wasn't in that type of situation. It's a good thing I didn't go there. It's a good thing I didn't hang out with those people. But let me me tell you right now, the only way that we will be victorious against the wiles of the devil and against the schemes of this world is if we couch ourselves within our God, into His Word, and into His protection. That's the only way that when Satan shows up at our doorstep and starts to bang on that door, that we can look at him and say, you've taunted God, you've taunted me, you've taunted His people, and you are going to lose this day. What about your situation? If you're sitting here this morning, for some reason you're apart from God, you should be scared because of this. Because all those forces are coming at you day in and day out. All of them want your soul. All of them want you to give yourself over to them. And you are defenseless. You're wandering out in the middle of that field thinking that your sling is going to do anything. Thinking that your sword that you picked up on the way out there is going to do anything. When in reality, the only thing that will stand against the forces that exist in this world is God, His protection. Couch yourself in Him. Hide behind the cross. Envelop yourself in His Word. And be on His side. Take Him into battle. Do that this morning as we stand, as we sing.
Go bury thy sorrow, let